What happens when every woman in a family tries to correct her mother's mistake? And by doing so, create a new mistake in the opposite direction? Chaos. Okay, chaos. But let's get into let's get into it. How do you know when you've actually broken a generational curse? This is the question that we're going through. It's a serious question because sometimes we call something breaking the cycle when all we have really done is we've run so hard in the opposite direction that we create a brand new problem. But we're so determined not to create that original problem that we knew. So, for example, if your mother was too controlling, you then promise that when you have your child, you're going to give them complete freedom. But now the child has no protection. Or your mother stayed in a dangerous relationship. So you promise you will never depend on anybody. But now nobody can get close enough to love you. Or your mother never gave you opportunity, so you give your child every opportunity imaginable. And then you become outraged when that child does not choose the life that you planned for her. This is what Grown Woman by Sarai Johnson is all about. Grown. And this book follows 4 generations of Black women: Evelyn, Charlotte, Corinna, and Camille. And each woman looks at the woman before her and thinks, consciously or not, I will not make her mistake. And to their credit, each woman doesn't. They actually make a completely different one. And I don't even know do we call it mistakes or they just create a new trauma? And then the trauma just has to rebrand from generation to generation. And that is why I do not want to give you a traditional review of this book. It is a really good book. Really, really good. I want us to have the conversation the book create. Who actually changed Camille's life? Who protected her? Who failed her? What do children owe the person who sacrificed for them? And when does I did the best I could stop being an explanation and start becoming a way to avoid apologizing? Because every woman in this family gives Camille something super valuable. And every gift arrives tangles in somebody's unfinished messiness. Okay? Messiness. So with that said, welcome to Last Reads. It's where we use fiction to talk about the very real choices people make around family, work, money, power, and becoming. I'm super interested in all these topics. With that said, if you have not read Grown Woman, let me give you enough time to understand why you may want to pick it up. Use your library app, use something. Okay? Because this is a multi-generational story told through 4 women's point of view. And it structures itself in a way that matters because throughout the book, nobody remains a villain and nobody remains the saint, right? When you are forced to get inside of somebody's head, when you get the backstory, it changes how you see things. And I like this book because it doesn't just like pick up at random moments. It'll tell you one person's perspective, then it'll go back and then the same thing tell you from their other perspective. And it doesn't do it so much that you kind of get bored. It does it with the right people. So you understand like, oh, this is what this person was thinking in this time frame. This is what was happening, right? So they always say this, there's both 2 sides to the story, then there's truth, right? So this gives you a little bit more wiggle room to come up with your own understanding of what's happening. So I really like that. You meet a woman first through the wound that she caused, right? I think you're like, oh, this is the result. Then the book turns around and says, okay, now that you get that, let me show you the wound she was carrying when she caused it. And I really enjoy that. And then you're irritated, but with context. And you're still saying, man, absolutely not. But you're saying this with less bass in your voice. The story moves through mothers, daughters, ambition, abandonment, money, protection, respectability, and the opportunity one generation tries to build for the next. It asks whether leaving can be an act of survival, whether sending a child away can be an act of love, and whether giving someone access gives you the rights to direct the life that that access creates, right? Just because I gave you the opportunity, do I not have ownership over you? And at the center of the book is Camille. We don't meet Camille till a little bit later, but she is the youngest of the four women, or the fourth generation. And by the time opportunity reaches her, it has passed through three generations of women making sacrifices, bargains, and mistakes that kind of lead to her. And we're reminded of that a few times. And Camille inherits access. She inherits money. She inherits talent. She inherits expectations. She inherits beauty, which I don't talk about too much in this. I wasn't planning on it, but maybe I will talk about it a little bit, right? The inheritance of beauty, right? Because there's like a conversation in this book around what beauty affords you and what maybe you have ownership of or you have access to if you're beautiful versus if you're not. So now that I'm saying that out loud, that's just something also very interesting. But anyway, what she does not inherit is a healed family. And I think that distinction is the whole book, because it just carries so much. From this point forward, I am getting into the characters. I'm getting into the messiness. I'm getting into the book and the choices that were made. So consider this your spoiler warning, your spoiler alert. If you have read the book, pull up a chair. Let's have a conversation. If you have not, you can stay, but do not come for me. I'm telling you right now, there are going to be spoilers. Now, let's meet these women. I've told you about these four women, these four generations. But I do not want to introduce them with just biographies. I want to introduce them through their own contradictions, because that is where the story comes alive. So first, let's begin with, I guess, what you would call the matriarch, right? Let's begin with Evelyn. Evelyn has the most resources. She has education, cultural access, money, and the ability to expose Camille to a much larger world. Evelyn is PhD, right? Like, she's on TV. Cornel West has quoted her. She is Dr. Evelyn Jackson, right? And Dr. Evelyn Jackson can give Camille a world that she, that Camille would not have had otherwise, right? Because of some decisions that her grandmother made, Evelyn's daughter. But Evelyn can give her that. Evelyn can put her and Camille in rooms that alter the life ahead of her. But Evelyn, with all these resources, failed to protect Charlotte. And that contradiction is so important, because we like to believe that the person with the most resources will automatically make the wisest choices, and that is not necessarily true. But we can acknowledge that resources can and will expand our options without healing our core wound. Right? So in the book, we see that Evelyn knows how to create opportunity. But that does not mean that she always knows how to create safety. And that's really, really important. Then we have Charlotte, Evelyn's daughter. Charlotte gets away from Evelyn and like literally leaves the whole state and goes someplace else. And she creates distance from her mother, deeply hurt her. And then by protecting herself from Evelyn, Charlotte becomes emotionally unavailable to Corinna, her child. She escapes one form of harm and creates another through absence, which is who, right? And this is where the 4 points of view become important. If we only had Corinna's perspective, Charlotte might simply look cold. But we understand what Charlotte was running from. And it takes a while to get there, but if we finally understand what Charlotte was running from, and we see the hurt, the betrayal, the survival underneath that distance that she created with her mom. However, we also understand that does not make Corinna less abandoned. It just means that the truth is complex. It has depth to it. Then there's Corinna. Corinna wants to love differently. She knows what it feels like to grow up without the kind of emotional security that she needed. So she becomes determined to give her daughter, Camille, something she believes Camille must have: a father in a conventional home and security. And in pursuing that, Corinna chooses Isaac, a man who ends up endangering Camille, which kind of ripples into some of the things that we see later on. And Corinna is one of the most fascinating women in this book because she can be extraordinarily strategic in one moment and painfully vulnerable in the next. She can protect Camille's financial future with a level of foresight that nobody else demonstrates in the book, and still can make intimate choices that place Camille at risk. And I want to go back to Corinna for a quick second because throughout the whole book, everyone gets so much book time on how gorgeous they are. You're pretty as a picture. Oh my gosh, when she walks in a room, like, even though Evelyn is 80 years old, we can tell how gorgeous she was, right? So Evelyn, Charlotte, Camille, there's so much time spent on how gorgeous they are. And there's this a good amount of time spent on how Corinna is not attractive, conventionally attractive, people like to say. And neither was her biological father. Now, I don't want to necessarily get into that part of the book, but it's so interesting to me because even though this is the case, Corinna, maybe because she understands this, and at some point when she's negotiating with her or Camille's father, she kind of says, like, sure, you have a future, so go ahead and do you. I really don't, right? I'm just like this like simple person. But in that simpleness, it gives her the freedom to be really strategic. She's just like, well, if this is what life has given me, if I'm not going to get the same, instant double looks or benefit of the doubt that my mother gets, then let me get myself like a better tangible future. And such a fascinating conversation. But anyway, Corinna, financially strategic in a way that is chef's kiss, and also very emotionally vulnerable, right? Because of the life that she lived and the wounds that she was a consequence of her mother's own wound, right? So Camille receives the hopes of every woman who came before her: Evelyn's access, Charlotte's recognition that Camille needs more, Corinna's financial protection. Their sacrifices give Camille options that none of them had. But Camille eventually had to escape those hopes too, because being the answer to your family's prayers sounds beautiful until you realize the prayers came with instructions, it came with rules, it came with the restrictions. And each woman tries to correct what her mother got wrong. Evelyn gives access but fails to create safety. Charlotte creates distance, but this awful harm in having that wall, right? And then Corinna tries to create a complete family, but invites danger into it. And then Camille receives everybody's options and has to fight for the right to make her own choice. So here's the first question I want you to hold. Every woman tried to correct her mother's mistake and somehow created another mistake in the opposite direction. Is that really breaking generational trauma? Or is that simply changing its shape? Because I think Evelyn is kind of set up as a person who tangibly changes Camille's life, and in a lot of ways that's true. But we also see how every other mothers, and I love how the book keeps saying the mothers, how every other mother really impacted Camille's life. Right? Camille ends up going to Washington to live with Evelyn. And because of this, she ends up traveling. She gained cultural exposure. Her world becomes larger because Evelyn has the money, the knowledge, and proximity to make it larger, right? If you put Camille's life on a resume, Evelyn's contribution is very easy to see. Evelyn gave her the experiences with names attached, the cities, the travel, the rooms. At one point, like, it's like a throwaway line, but they're like, this even tells you that the time and place the book is set in, right? They're like, oh, if the Obamas win the election and they come to DC, will they end up in the same school that Camille is going to? So when you look at Charlotte, who chose to move to the middle of nowhere, Tennessee, right, to now her granddaughter may or may not end up going to school with the Obamas. That's cool. So we kind of see Evelyn as like the forefront, but before Camille could walk through any of these doors, Charlotte had to put her own wants aside and recognize that, yes, Camille would be better off elsewhere. And Corinna had to also kind of just give a beat and say, you know what, it's okay. Right. We'll let this person go that we love deeply for the greater good. And that is not a small sacrifice. Because sometimes the greatest contribution to your life comes from a person who knows I cannot take you there. But I will not let my pride prevent you from going. And the step granddad, I guess, David says something towards the end of the book where he's just like, sometimes you just have to let people go. And that is like so like you can have so much love for a person and you would want the best for them and you want to like be in it for them and grow with them and build with them. But then it's just like between my own wounds, your wounds, whatever the case might be, it is not best that stay here. We do things together. And that's the truth, but it's also where the book even becomes messier, right? Because we see Camille kind of like going back and forth, like, why is my mother continuously like giving me to someone else, right? Because Camille goes from obviously her mother's household with just her mother, then Isaac gets introduced and he brings violence into the household. Once that happens, Corinna makes a decision to have Camille go to her mother, Charlotte, because at that point, Charlotte is just a better, more nurturing mother figure. So Camille feels a wound of like, oh my God, why did my mother give me to my grandmother? And then again, her mother decides to give her to her great grandmother, Evelyn. And we see the grand scheme of things that this is the right choice in terms of access, proximity, and not like, being another teenage mother or having limitations to her success. But it does beg the question, at what point do we start discussing abandonment? Is this abandonment or is this like the most selfless form of parenting? I don't know those questions. Because we love the noble version of this question. We imagine ourselves saying, of course I would release my child to it a better life. But would we? Like that's a lot to sit with. That's a lot to sit with of like, is my child better off with me and all my stuff? At least I can see them, or do I put them in the hands of someone else? And then for Charlotte, if you in her shoes, would you send your child to live with the very person who wounded you because that person can offer the child something you could not? Would you risk your child loving that person? Would you risk your child looking back at your life and deciding that you were the limitation she needed to escape and knowing that you kept her? Because Charlotte's decision requires a different type of humility than Camille's did. Because Charlotte had to separate her history with Evelyn from Camille's possible future with Evelyn. And Corinna has to live with the fact that another woman may be able to provide Camille with what she cannot. That is love without the satisfaction of being centered as a result. So it's like just shout out to every single woman like in this trajectory of what they had to confront. It's just so much. We often give all the credit to the person who provides a visible opportunity and overlook the people who absorb the invisible cost, right? The teacher gets credit for the scholarship, the mentor gets credit for the introduction, the executive gets credit for the promotion. But somewhere there may be like a mother who's rearranging childcare, who's rearranging her own wounds. It's just so much to sit with. And this book does a beautiful job in really highlighting all the different things that just go into decisions about life and emotions and all that stuff. And it's so interesting about also just standing up for the people. Corinna, not only does she make this decision to let go of her daughter, her only child. She also makes another decision, which is so interesting to me because Corinna is the least educated of this whole generation. But when it comes to the choice of like, okay, fine, how do I care for my daughter? The guy that she had Camille with, Johnny, part of the reason why Johnny doesn't claim Camille is because he is about to go to Vanderbilt. He's about to be the big football player. And by the end of the story, he is. And in that moment, he doesn't want to keep Camille, but he also is just like, I will do the right thing and pay child support. And I will also do this like one lump sum, right? And Corinna says after a day or so, like, actually, no. You have such a huge upside. And by me sacrificing my daughter knowing her dad, like you will be able to be this big superstar football player. So no, you cannot just go and then pay me like minimum whatever. Here's a contract that says that Camille, you will put 5% of your earnings every year, no matter what you make, 5% of that into an account just for Camille, and she can't touch it to 21. And with that, I will keep your secret. No one has to know that you have this child out of wedlock. We won't take your, good boy image. Your wife doesn't have to know. That's your business, right? And that is so powerful that Corinna like really had that foresight to negotiate that for her child, making Camille a millionaire, multimillionaire by the time she was 20. And I just want to like clap for Corinna, like, because my gosh, because degrees are not the same thing as discernment. Let me say that again. Degrees are not the same thing as discernment. You can have all the letters behind your name, even in front of your name, because a lot of this book was also about some choices that were made where the woman felt the need to be married or partnered, even though their partners were not the best for them. But at large in society, whatever, having that missus was really important. Right? And then we see in a lot of ways that even like degrees and pedigree came into the mix. But this person said, no, I'm gonna lean into discernment. I'm gonna lean into my own judgment. And I just love that. And bravo. So with that said, I want to tangent a little bit because a question I had was, would Corinna have negotiated that fiercely if the money had been for her? And I do not think she would have. We see how she lets go of a lot of things in her life. And this is such a tragedy inside the triumph because so many women are brilliant negotiators when they're fighting for someone else. You put a child, a client, a student, a friend, or even an organization behind the request, and suddenly they have evidence, talking points, a backup plan, and the spirit of a union representative. But ask the same woman to negotiate for herself, and now she's worried about sounding difficult, about sounding too much, about being ungrateful. Corinna recognizes Camille's value before she fully recognizes her own. And by the end of the book, she does, and it's so beautiful. But like, so if this is you, if you see yourself in Corinna in a lot of ways, and I have too, like, give yourself the grace, give yourself the something. If you can advocate fiercely for everybody except for yourself, the person you protect, picture that person whose future is affected by your choices and negotiate as if you are negotiating for her, for them. Because often you are. Truly and truly, often you are. If you accept less money, fewer options, or poor treatment because you're afraid to advocate for yourself, the cost rarely stops with you. It changes what you can save, where you can live, how long you can rest, whether you can leave, and what you can offer the people that's pretty big. Right? Corinna's negotiation is not simply a money moment, it's an act of imagination. She can see that Johnny's future, his future value should be part of Camille's security. And I think that deserves so much applause. So much applause. So just shout out to her. Because not only did Corinna's courage and selflessness in a lot of ways allow Camille to have exposure to a ton of options, it also gave her ownership of real things, of money, of capital, which gave her leverage when she was an adult. It's so interesting that Evelyn, Camille, Charlotte all chose partnerships and marriages, not for themselves all the time, but more for others or for what society would say. And that cost them in a lot of ways. It's another conversation of what it means to be highly educated or highly worthy. You check so many boxes, but then you're also part of society. And as a woman, so much of your value is still attached to it. And it brings so much shame to your life if you're not attached to a man. I know we think it's changing or whatever, but it's still very true. That's it. So I'm not excusing some of Corinna's choices, but I do want to applaud Corinna because shut up. Okay, look at my notes. So the other thing I wanted to talk about is apologies, boundaries, holding on to things, forgiveness. One of the lines that stayed with me comes from Camille reflecting on her grandfather, David, Charlotte's husband. And I'm paraphrasing here, but Camille appreciates that he can acknowledge his mess without immediately trying to defend himself. So he does not rush to say, well, I did the best I could at the time. He essentially says, I did it. It hurt someone. It hurt a number of people. I was wrong. And sometimes that is all people are asking for. And at this point, so many of us have lived lives and we understand the circumstances, etc. But when you're addressing the person that you harmed, I am still harmed, right? You don't need to submit a 6-part documentary about your childhood, about your state of mind. You don't need a PowerPoint presentation of it. And because the things that people will come to it. Camille is like, well, she doesn't want to know what her great-grandmother Evelyn did to Charlotte because she's afraid that will taint her relationship to her great-grandmother. And eventually she finds out, and then that definitely adds more color to her understanding of everyone's relationship. But ultimately, she still holds that, okay, yes, my great-grandmother hurt my grandmother, but I also have a very different relationship with all 3 mothers, with my great-grandmother, with my grandmother, and with my mother. All right. So we can you can tell people, or through life, people will figure out, the things that happen. But in the moment that you're talking to the person that you call harm, just apologize. Because constantly telling someone I did the best I could is completely true. But it's true but useless, because it essentially is useless in repair, right? Because you're asking the person you hurt to stop talking about their pain and start sympathizing with yours. And don't mishear me. There's room for people to sympathize with your pain because it's real and it's valid. However, in the moment that you harmed someone, the goal is to say, hey, I see that I harmed you. That was never my intention. I'm sorry. I'm really, really sorry. I did the thing and I'm sorry. Because otherwise, then you're asking that person to comfort you during the apology. Now, the 4 perspectives in this book allow us to understand each woman's trauma. We get there. And it's one of the book's strengths. But there's also a danger in understanding everybody, because then we start excusing everybody. Trauma explains behavior, but it does not perform the repair. So there needs to be a both end. The book gives every woman an explanation. Camille's grandfather is one of the few people willing to give an apology, right? And at certain moments throughout the book, we see people apologizing, but for a good chunk of it, and this might be part of the process, a good chunk of it, people are explaining themselves, right? Rather than saying, hey, I harmed you, I'm sorry. So I think that was a very interesting theme and topic of what is the sequence of context, explanation, and apology. What is the mix of ego, pride, and apology? Because and who does apology impact? Because when we think about Charlotte's refusal to forgive Evelyn, it would be easy to say Charlotte should forgive because forgiveness is healing. People love to prescribe forgiveness when they haven't lived the experience of the person. Charlotte's refusal protects her in so many ways of the very deep harm that was caused to her. And her boundary says, you don't get access to me, because when you had access to me, you allowed these things to happen. As the book progresses, we see, or even not even as the book progresses, I feel like maybe the first chapter, we see how also creating that boundary turns Charlotte into a very specific type of woman, and it impacts the way that she engages with her own child. right? And I'm not here to litigate whether Charlotte should forgive or should not forgive Evelyn. Like, that's her own journey. And I think it's a very difficult thing to process. But I also think a question that we can ask is, what happens when maintaining a boundary costs you a life you actually wanted, a relationship that you actually wanted? At what point does a boundary stop protecting you and begin imprisoning you? And we just need to look at the whole thing. Did Evelyn ever take responsibility without asking Charlotte to understand her first? Should she have asked Charlotte to understand her before? Like, I don't know. Knowing why your mother hurt you may make the story clearer, but it does not make the hurt smaller. And understanding your mother's trauma does not create a debt of forgiveness, right? The injured person should not have become the family historian, therapist, and kind of pardon broadly before someone can simply say, I hurt you, I'm sorry, I see you, I'm sorry. And we could have a conversation of like what Charlotte's boundaries cost her and how maybe it went from protecting to imprisonment in a lot of ways. But we also see the family focusing a lot on Charlotte's refusal to forgive. And I think that's interesting. And by the end of it, Charlotte comes to her own revelation. And so does every woman. Every woman like contends with this. And I think that's why this book is so beautiful, because there's no clean answer to the path, right? Does an apology change whether you can forgive? And if the apology never comes, do you release the boundary for your own freedom, for your own life, or do you keep it? I don't know. I personally have lived a life where I've seen how my own mother held on to a lot of the hurts. And earlier I mentioned how a lot of the women in this book kept saying like, oh, I don't want to be like my mother. And then ended up doing something kind of parallel. And I've lived that. And my mom would tell me so much like, well, at least you're lucky that I'm not doing X, Y, Z. But then she caused her harm in her own way. And then now I look at my life and I'm like, oh, in these ways that my mom hurt me, I'm like trying to be above it all. But like it's impacting my relationships, it's impacting how I show up, it's impacting how I am or I'm not vulnerable with people, right? So even though I'm like creating these boundaries or creating these things to not be like my mom and then to not live to not hold on to that hurt that she had that passed on to me, I'm still holding on to her and that's passing on. That's hard. This book is not an easy book. It's an easy read, I will say that. Like you flow through the book and whatnot. But if you have a mother wound, if you are going through anything, it gives you pause. It gives you reflection because you just have to sit there and think about like, what am I doing? And what life am I creating for myself? By the end of the book, Camille does not inherit a healed family, right? But she does have stories of how different people have grappled with healing and forgiveness and boundaries. And she also has evidence to see how the way each person came to terms with it impacts their life and their own quality of life and their own happiness. It's such a beautiful book. And I think depending on where you and your own healing journey and your own relationship with your mother, it just gives you a way to think through the possibilities. But also it's just a stark reminder that we only have one life. And if we, I don't know the word is outsource it to someone else, what does that mean? Like when we look back at our lives and look at the opportunities that we did not pursue, the emotions we did not allow ourselves to have because we thought we were doing something different, but essentially we're operating from the wound. And if you're operating from a wound, you're in the wound. I want to hear your thoughts. If you've read this book, if you have a mother wound, etc., let me know how you're grappling. And there's so many kind of books around this. I also just read Leave Your Mess at Home, which I will probably review next. So we'll get into it. With that, it's this last read where the last page is where the real conversation begins, right? Because then you start to dig into the themes and you start to like look at the full story and say, like, where do I come in? Where do I see myself doing this? Well, I have made these decisions, yes or no, right? My last thought is this. Every woman grown woman, tried to give Camille something she had needed herself. And Camille's inheritance was not a perfect family, a predetermined future, or even like net healing. It was a power to decide what happened next, a power to have agency over your own life. And maybe that's what breaking the cycle looks like. Not getting everything right, but finally giving the next woman a choice, finally giving yourself a choice to decide what to do.